Thanks for joining us on the Dinero project. I'm Melissa Don-Port. I have over 40 years background in food, for those of you that don't know me. I was raised in a kitchen where my mum was an incredible cook and my grandmother. I've got photos of sitting in the sink and tasting raw fish and decorating cakes, and I spent my life sitting in the kitchen sink until I was too big. I then took my passion of food, I studied food, and I became a food stylist. I styled in studios for magazines and cookbooks and TV commercials for many years. I lectured at colleges all over Sydney for years. And then when I was married and had young children, I started a cooking school from home. Nice to see you, Nessie. Thanks for joining us. So from my cooking school, which I ran for almost 10 years, had hundreds of students, I then sort of diversed into my food tours, and that's what I do today. I've spent the last 10 years or so running food tours throughout Sydney and actually Australia and around the world. My passion is street food, and that's really what I love. You can see more of my, you can follow me at Mia Cucina, MIACUCINA.com.au. You can find me on Instagram or Facebook and follow my journey. Okay, so for those of you that don't know the Dinero project, it was really created out of isolation, the brainchild of Danny Grimberg, where we brought together curators in all platforms. And we now have a wonderful website which is full of resources while we're in isolation. And you Victorians, you'll really need it over the next 6 weeks. And it covers food and art and music and theatre and spirituality and wellness. And, there's a yoga session every morning, and we have wonderful, absolutely fabulous resources. So if you're unfamiliar with the project, jump onto dinero.org.au and check it out. Everyone's coming in this morning. Okay, so really, we're going to demystify the idea of the differences between poaching and stewing. And instead of guessing, you will have the confidence today to be able to move forward and really feel confident in knowing what you're doing is the right thing. So we're going to start with a little science experiment. You probably didn't think that we'd be having a science class today. So this is how it goes. We have a pear, a raw pear, and the raw pear goes into water. So what happens here is naturally, it's called osmosis, where the two environments, the pear is one environment, the water is another environment. And naturally over time, there has to become an equilibrium in the environments. Okay, so at the moment, the pear is very sweet and the water has no sugar content. So over time, if we leave the pear sitting in the water, the pear will release sugars into the water to make osmosis, to make an equilibrium in this container. And that's exactly what happens when we cook. So if we want to stew something, and stewing, we want the fruit to break down and we want it to be mushy, okay? We want it to be soft and we want it to, we want it to be, we want it to be stewed. So that's what happens is we don't use any sugar. If we want to keep the pear in shape, if we want the pear to be poached and we want to save its shape, we need to add sugar to the water. Sugar in the water will provide an equilibrium in balance so the pear won't release any sugars. Okay, so I hope you understand that. So when we are poaching, we need to add sugar to the water. The pear doesn't take on any sugar, but it won't release any sugars into the water. So basically, when we are stewing, we learned that we don't put any sugar in the water to start with. So how often have you tried to stew apples or stew pears? You've added sugar into the water and the pears and the apples don't collapse and you stand there trying to squash them and mash them up. That's the reason why, because you've added sugar into the water. Okay, and so when we are poaching, quite often, if you haven't added sugar to the water, your pears may become very soft and sort of become stewed and break down because there is no sugar in the water. Okay, that's our little science experiment for this morning. So we're going to start off with the idea of stewing. We have our 2 apples you know, let's talk about the different types of apples. I did post a chart with the recipes of the different types of apples you can use. Now for different dishes, I use different apples. It also depends on the season. If fruit is in season, it's something that I would prefer to use in season, 1, because they're cheaper, and 2, because they're fresher. If I'm making stewed apples, I do want a sweeter apple, so I will use a red apple, and my preference is Pink Ladies. I love a Pink Lady. If I'm wanting to make an apple sauce, so I'm going to stew the apples and then puree it, I prefer to use a more tart, the green Granny Smith apple. So when we are stewing, you know, there are a lot of additions to develop the flavours. A lot of people are still joining us this morning. A lot of flavours we can add to our stewed fruit. So if I come closer to you here, we have nutmeg, a whole nutmeg, and we can just crush the nutmeg, and the nutmeg can be placed in the stewed fruit, in the poaching. We have here cardamom pods. Star anise is also a beautiful additive. Cinnamon stick. You know, at the moment I found some lovely fresh bay leaves. They are wonderful in poaching. The vanilla bean is also lovely. And when we're poaching, a lot of people like saffron. Saffrons are also a lovely additive. Just gives it more body when we're cooking. So, so with the stewing, I do use, like I mentioned, the red apple I do prefer. It's important that I'm a big believer of recycling, reusing. All your scraps should be going into worm farms, into your council food scrap collection, depending on which council you live in. If I am actually pureeing my apples, if I'm going to puree it to make apple sauce for potato latkes, for, you know, as part of a meal, I will actually keep the skin on my green apple. It gives the sauce a wonderful colour. It's much more nutritional and saves you a lot of time. But if you're stewing, I do prefer not to have the skins because the fruit breaks down, and I find with the skin on, it does become a little bit tough. So our apple skins go into our food scrap bin. So you can either use your apple corer to remove the core. This is one of my, I don't have many gadgets in my kitchen, but this is one of my favourites. When the kids used to go to school, to get an apple, a whole apple with the skin on, and all you do is push down straight through the apple. you'll see like that. So when the kids went to school, especially when they were missing their teeth, the skin's on the apple and it stays, the whole apple stays together until recess time when they get to it, and the whole apple opens up into segments, and then all you do is remove the core. So this little gadget, I mean, you can pick it up in Coles, any kitchen shop. It segments the apple very quickly, the core comes out, and then all you have to do is to cut it into pieces. So when you're stewing fruit, and I don't know, I've been doing this for years, I like some big pieces and some little pieces. I like the little pieces to break down. And I like some chunky pieces in it. So depending on how fine you cut up the apple will depend on how it breaks down in your saucepan. Okay, so that goes straight into our pot. So to our stewed apple, our raw apple, we add a little bit of water, not too much, and then that goes on heat. Remember, we're stewing, so there's no water to be added to that. Not until the other end, in any case. So the apples are on medium, sort of low temperature. To that, I am going to add a cinnamon stick, because I do love spices. I'm also going to add, let me think about who's going to eat it. I'm going to add 2 star anise to the pot. So the apples aren't covered in the water. There's only maybe half a cup of water in the pot. And I'm going to cover that. Almost cover it, leave the lid off a little bit, and that is going to simmer away. Okay, so that's stewing apple. Now we're going to move into poaching. When we are poaching, it's really important a couple of things in terms of the fruit. One, not to use old fruit. You know, there's a place and time to be using sort of older fruit, but for poaching, especially when you want to keep it and give it a longer shelf life, the fruit does need to be fresh. And how do you know when the fruit is at its freshest and when the fruit is in season? It's when the prices are cheap. So if you see, I saw some apples yesterday for $9 a kilo, which is ridiculous. That tells me that those apples aren't in season. It tells me that they probably have been in cold storage, and it's probably not what we want to be using for poaching. So when you are poaching, it is very seasonal. Don't sit down and write a menu and go, right, I'm poaching nectarines for dinner, when we're in the middle of winter and the nectarines are $15 a kilo out there, because they're not in season. They probably either have been frozen or cold storage, and they feel fine when you fill them in the shop, and when you get them home, they are all sort of soft. It's important to be buying in season. So at the moment, there's not a lot of choice because we are in winter. It's pears and apples, but we can make wonderful things with poached pears and apples and beautiful flavours. And in the summer months, when it is warmer, you know, to use your nectarines and your peaches and the apricots. And, you know, we're so lucky in this country. We have wonderful, absolutely fabulous produce available. So remember that what is in season is when the price is cheap. It's really good to, you know, follow someone like Harris Farm. Dave Harris always tells you what's in season at the moment. And that's how you base your menu and base your meals about what is in season. Okay, So let's now talk about when we are poaching. It's really important to, first of all, have your syrup ready before you start peeling your pears or your apples. That needs to be in your pot ready. So as soon as you've peeled your apple or your pear, it goes straight into the syrup and it won't go brown. You know, sometimes you peel an apple and it sits there a little bit too long and it does go dark. So the rule of thumb when you're poaching is 2 to 1. 2 cups of water to 1 cup of sugar. When a recipe calls for sugar, oh wow, it's going wild here. The stewed apple. When a recipe calls for sugar, sugar normally just means white sugar, okay? White sugar has a larger grain, a larger granule than caster sugar. Caster sugar is for making toffee, where you want to dissolve the sugar quickly. It's for cake making, where again, when you're beating, the sugar dissolves. But when you're putting white sugar in with a lot of water, it dissolves quickly. So you don't need caster sugar, basically, when you are poaching. So we have a cup of white sugar to 2 cups of water. So in my pot this morning, we're going to add some fresh bay leaves. We're going to add a cinnamon stick. We're going to add some star anise. We're going to crush some cardamom pods. So we've just bruised them, so the flavors are easier to release. And then we're also going to use a fresh vanilla bean. And I want to talk about vanilla beans because a lot of people are quite nervous to use a vanilla bean. And there are lots of different ways how to use a vanilla bean. I'm just going to turn my stewed apple down a little bit more. So vanilla beans in this country are expensive. You can pay $7 to $10 for a vanilla bean. What I loved about when we used to travel was going to Bali and buying, 50 vanilla beans, which is a wonderful experience. That won't be happening for a while. So this vanilla bean is a pod. It grows obviously on the branch. It's dried, and a lot of people think it's sweet, but it's actually not sweet. It's the flavor is very fragrant, and it's when you add vanilla to sugar and to other ingredients, that's when the sweetness comes through. So one way of using your vanilla bean is just to add the whole vanilla bean into your pot with your poaching. You can cook it whole. You can then remove it, you wash it, and you let it dry, and you can use it again. The other way of using it, and I want you to see whether you can, I'm going to move this out of the way here. Have a look on my board. I'm going to move that there. I'm going to slice the vanilla bean in half. So you keep the vanilla bean flat on the board, and with your knife, you just seesaw backwards and forwards, going through the center of the vanilla bean very slowly, using your fingers as a guide. Look at this. So inside the vanilla bean, can you see the little beans? See the very, very fine vanilla. So I'll show you how when you scrape it up, you scrape it out of the actual pod, and this is what it looks like. It's like the little caviar eggs. of the vanilla bean. So that is going to go into my poaching liquid. So I'm going to scrape the meat out of the bean, and all of that goes into the pot. Okay, so now I'm going to use all the beans. So now my liquid is ready for my poaching. If you can see there, I'm going to dissolve the sugar on a gentle heat. And as that sugar is dissolving and making a really lovely syrup, I then will get my pears ready. So that will go in at the same time. I did see some questions. I'm going to pause here. Oh, Joanne, you made the olive kataki pastries. Aren't they fabulous? I do have to remind you that my mother created that recipe many, many years ago, way before they are what they are today. Nessie, hi, Nessie. Yes, you can use vanilla essence. You absolutely can use vanilla essence and vanilla extract. So there's a big difference between vanilla essence and vanilla extract. And in the old days, we had no choice but to just use vanilla essence. But these days, you can buy wonderful vanilla extract, which is a purer form. And also remember with vanilla essence, a lot of it is artificial imitation, so have a look carefully on the branding. And remember that you don't need as much as you would use if you're using vanilla essence. Vanilla essence, you might need half a teaspoon. When you're using extract, it's concentrated. You just need a couple of drops. So the other thing with the vanilla bean, which I wanted to tell you, so when the vanilla bean is cooked and poached, I will pull out the actual bean of the vanilla. I will wash it under water. I dry it in the sun, let it sunbake. And once it is dry, I then store it in my sugar. And so I use my scraps, my vanilla bean scraps, making sure they are really dry, and I just collect them in my caster sugar. And over the years, some of these vanilla beans have been here for 20 years. And this creates a really beautiful vanilla sugar. Okay, I just have to boast and show you how organized I am here. See that? Caster sugar. How good's that? How good's that? Oh, these apples smell so good. So good. Okay, so our apples are going there. We're going to add a little bit more water to the apple. It's going to continue. So now we're ready for to add our fruit to our syrup. Our sugar is almost dissolved. Our spices are infusing in that sugar. Oh, that smells so good. I absolutely love vanilla bean. So I'll tell you where else I use vanilla bean. My kids love custard. My Bobber used to make an unbelievable cream caramel. I make a great cream caramel. And I use the vanilla bean in the milk. One little tip, if you're ever making cream caramel, is in the old days, I used to use cream and milk, where in actual fact, a better cream caramel is all milk. I know I'm getting off track, but I just needed to share that. I know Zoom doesn't have a smell, but it is just delightful in here this morning. Okay, so I wanted to show you one more trick. When you are peeling, chopping, you've got a lot of food, and you don't have your food scrap bin, like I do. I just like to put a piece of paper down, and then I collect all of my skins, and then, you know, the kids can take that out to the worm farm. That's really important. And, you know, everyone should be considering a worm farm if you have a garden. It's so good for the garden. What comes out of the worm farm is wonderful. We've still got people joining. Okay, so in terms of, we're in the middle of winter, I've chosen some beautiful pears. These, I find the best pears are the imperfect picks. They're the ones that are of odd shapes and, you know, they're different sizes. As a food stylist, I used to spend hours running around town for the perfect pear that would have a beautiful leaf hanging off it. And, you know, that would be my hero pear. So when you are choosing pears, try and choose the smaller ones. I prefer to serve a lovely whole pear rather than cutting a large pear in half. I mean, you can still, it's still lovely to serve half a pear, but to always hand pick them and find smaller pears. You can use, firm pears. Yes, firm pears you can use. All you need to do is just cook them slightly longer. I just want to show you the stewed apple. Look how lovely the yellow colour is. Can you see? I might go back here a bit. Beautiful, rich yellow colour there. Oh, those fumes. So yes, they're the pears. You know, I am quite particular. I would sit a pear down to see, you know, how it's sat. You can always trim off its bottom to make sure that it stands nicely. So when you are serving, your pear doesn't sort of sit on a plate lying down flat. Okay, so peeling the pear. Remember that every peel that you do, you will be able to see what it looks like once it is poached. So you want to try and evenly do lovely long strokes down the side of the pear. You start from the top. Obviously, you want to keep the stalk intact because that looks really pretty on a plate. Yes, when you are preserving them, you still keep the stalks on. Make your way around the pear. I do, if you haven't seen, the Japanese peeler is really a beautiful tool. You get a much wider surface to peel. And then around the bottom. Okay, so we want to remove the pips. There's nothing worse than having to work your way around a pear that has all of the core on the inside. So here's a little Mia Cucina trick. A melon baller. If you don't have a melon baller, you can use a very small teaspoon. The melon baller has two sides, a little one and a, let's go like that, the larger one. I'm going to use the larger one. So underneath the pear, we push the melon baller down and turn it round into a circle. Now, the pear, its seeds are not down the bottom. Its seeds sit a little bit higher. So you need to go in one more time with one more circle. And that's what it looks like. Okay, so once you have peeled your pear, the syrup is ready, the sugar has dissolved, and this goes straight into the liquid. So the pears can be firm. You don't want the fruit too ripe. I always find that if I know that I'm poaching, I will buy the fruit a day or two beforehand, because when you do get it from your greengrocer, they are very firm. I leave it out of the fridge for a day or two before I use them. And just remember with ripening fruit, a lot of people always are confused if you put anything in the fridge, it stops the ripening process. So if your pears are rock hard when you buy them, and if you put them straight into the fridge, they will not ripen in the fridge. So you need to make sure they are at a stage that you eat them and then put them in the fridge. Okay, so we're going to use the melon baller and scoop out our first circle and then our second. And you'll see in this one, there's still a little bit of seed. I do a little bit more and then that goes into the water. We happen to have some other pears just sitting here. That's lovely. They're all going into the syrup. You should see what they look like. They're all covered in vanilla bean. That's gorgeous. Okay, I am going to add a little bit more water just to cover the pears. And then the lid will go on there. And that will steam. Okay, so we have our apples. Our stewed apples are looking really very good and they are softening up. They smell delicious. It's really good to clean up as you go. Whatever you do, whatever you're cooking, clean up and rinse everything as you are cooking. It just means at the other end, it's a much easier wash. It's really one of my strongest suggestions, and with my kids and with anyone when I had my cooking school, when I lectured, rinse as you go along. Have everything rinsed. Don't leave bowls in the sink covered in cream or cake mixture. If you rinse as you go along, it's much easier to clean up at the other end. Okay, so here are some pears that we did earlier on. I'm going to move this away so we can see here. So these are poached pears. It's still warm. It's actually still very hot. And the most important thing once you have been poaching is where you store them. And it's really important to have sterilized jars. So sterilizing means that the jar has been heated to a very high temperature once it has been cleaned. So the dishwasher is the best place to sterilize your jars and to clean them. And if you don't have a dishwasher, you wash your jars and then place them into the oven with the lid, unless it's plastic, and you leave that in the oven for about half an hour on a low temperature, and that will sterilize the jar. As soon as you have poached your fruit, and another little tip is, how do you know when your fruit is ready, is you test it. The old-fashioned cake skewer or a satay stick, something very fine, and you want to put it right through the fruit. There's nothing worse than when you see someone trying to chase a poached pear around a dinner plate trying to get it. You really want your guests to be able to use a spoon and to cut into the pear without having to hear everyone, you know, chopping up their plates. So make sure it is really well poached. Once it goes into a sterilized jar when it's hot, so it goes straight from the saucepan into the jar, and you seal it very quickly. And what happens with that seal, it forms a suction. So it actually has a suction in the lid, and you can see and feel that this lid is a little bit concave. You know, when you open up a brand new jar of anything, tomato paste or whatever it is, you'll hear it pop. And that pop means that it was airtight. And that's exactly, if you want to be placing the poached fruit into storage, or if you want to keep it for a long time, you need to make sure that it is airtight. Let's see whether we can hear a pop. Wow, That is really airtight. So this is a really good example. To release the air, I'm going to get a knife, a fine knife, and listen. Wow, that was very tight. Okay, so I'm going to, oh, this smells delicious. Look at this jar. So the best jars are the jars that you've bought sun-dried tomatoes in. It's the jars that you've bought something imported from overseas. Can you see how lovely? Star anise, the cinnamon stick, cardamom, there's a vanilla bean in there. That is delicious. I think we might have to try some of our pear this morning. Okay, so we're going to open up for questions. Sugar substitute if you don't want to use sugar. Very good question. So, for example, with the stewed fruit, I actually don't eat sugar. So once my stewed fruit is fully cooked, I then will add my maple syrup to it. You can add coconut sugar to it. It will make it a little darker. If you add a grainy sugar, you can add brown sugar. You need to make sure that it dissolves in the heat. And that's the wonderful thing when you're stewing with fruits, that they are really very sweet. It's really important to taste it before you add sugar to it. So when you are poaching, who did ask that? When you are poaching, the sugar actually doesn't go into the pear. All the sugar does is stop the pear from releasing sugar. Okay, so if you're just eating the pear actually won't have any sugar in it if you have the right balance. With the syrup from the pears, that will have the sugar in it. So I would suggest maple syrup. Honey gives you a much stronger flavour. Coconut sugar is also great. Okay, to serve the pear, this morning. So these poached pears have come straight from the pot, and the juices have gone straight into the jar. Look how beautiful that pear is. That is gorgeous and so soft. I want you to see how soft it is. Now, so the syrup, I have poured the whole syrup over the pears and left that in the jar. The other option is to remove the pears from the saucepan and then reduce the syrup until it is quite sticky. If you wanted to serve your pear with a very sticky sauce, reduce the syrup, which means remove the lid, let all the steam escape, and that will reduce. And that will make a really delicious sticky syrup. But for me, it really was just to have lovely poached pears in the fridge where we can have it on top of cereal or, you know, dessert, that type of thing. So reducing the syrup will make a richer, sticky sweet. Also, you know, I wanted to just say with saffron threads are also really lovely to be placed into your pears when you're poaching. If you haven't poached before, it's really good to start off, I think, just with a basic recipe and then go and experiment with your red wine. Adding red wine in with your pears give that beautiful depth and richness. You know, it's probably not so good when you've got the kids, but great when you're entertaining. Red wine's a wonderful addition to poached pears. So if you have questions, we are now going to open up the line so you can unmute yourself and you can ask me any questions that you would like, food related. To unmute yourself, the button is on the bottom left corner if you're on a computer. Any questions, guys? Let's have them. What I am going to serve my Pear with this morning is as I am sugar-free, dairy-free, I got some beautiful coconut yogurt. Good morning. I can hear someone.
If you were using red wine, how much would you add to the water?
So I would use about a cup of red wine. You don't want to be using your most expensive red wine. For me, it's always, you know, that leftover bottle of red wine that you didn't finish. That's a good opportunity to go, right, what am I going to do with that red wine if you don't plan on drinking it, is to, you know, go and buy some Pear and use that. So you would substitute some of your water for the red wine.
Thank you.
Melissa, if you wanted to do rhubarb, would you do it the same way?
Exactly. So with rhubarb, you cook it without the sugar if you want it to collapse. If you want to keep it firm to add it to a pastry tart, you would add sugar. It's the same thing, it's osmosis, okay? So always remember, if you want the fruit to collapse, you don't add sugar to the end. Now, rhubarb can be very tart. So you cook it only in water, and then once it's all lovely and soft and stringy, you then add the sugar to it.
Nice to you before.
Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, I love rhubarb. Rhubarb and custard.
No, rhubarb and apple.
Rhubarb and apple, delicious. Absolutely delicious. Okay, so I've got some lovely coconut yogurt here. I'm going to add some lightly pan-fried almond flakes. What I do like to have in my kitchen, I'm a big cinnamon lover. I get a little shaker, like a little, you know, from the Chinese store, and I just have it there to sprinkle onto absolutely anything. Instead of always going to your cupboard to find your cinnamon, I just have that in a little shaker. Look how delicious this is. I want to show you how delicate and soft this Pear is. My spoon goes in.
What did you have in the shaker?
So good, so tender, and absolutely delicious. Can you see? Let me show you how soft this Pear is. I really can go through the whole Pear. Beautiful and tender. It's really important to make sure that you cook your Pear through. Okay, if the liquid seems to be reducing too much, have the confidence to add a little bit more water to keep it covered. Any more questions?
Yes, Melissa, hi.
Yeah.
You said that you are sugar-free. So does that mean that that bottle you made with maple syrup?
No, I used sugar in the syrup, but I won't drink that syrup.
Okay.
So if you, you know, you can be using coconut sugar.
But
And
that's,
I probably would use coconut sugar. Maple syrup, you'd need you know, a cup and a half of maple syrup. I would use coconut sugar. Coconut sugar is out of this world. So it hasn't been refined. It's not like white sugar, raw sugar, brown sugar. So it's a simpler sugar, and it will give you a slightly darker color, like you're using brown sugar. But that is delicious. That is absolutely delicious.
thank you.
Yeah, coconut sugar you can buy in bulk. I know Costco sell it bulk. There's a couple of wholesalers. I find, because I am sugar-free, I use a lot of it. Any other questions? So just to recap, when you're stewing fruit, do not add sugar. Let the walls break down of the fruit, and then once it is cooked, you then add sugar to taste. Like in the rhubarb, like the stewed apple, like the stewed pears. If you want to keep the fruit to its shape in poaching, you then need to add sugar with the water to keep the fruit whole. So there is a balance between both of the environments, the liquid and the pear. Okay, so our stewed fruit, just going to show you what that looks like. Ah, it smells so good. The different apples do break up in different ways, and these pink ladies actually are quite firm. So I am sort of helping them along with a little bit of a crush with the fork. Remember, there is no sugar in here, and I actually don't think it needs any sugar at all. We really should be cutting down, I know I say it all the time, we should be cutting down a sugar intake. If you wanted to add any sugar, I would suggest it would be a natural sugar. I'm going to show you in my jar here with our spoon, our sterilised jar. Here is our, oh, it just smells so good. I like to add my cinnamon stick, and I like to add all of my spices and keep it in the jar. And then as it cools, that flavour really just sort of strengthens and becomes bolder and more complex in the cook. The lid goes on straight away, which is really important, to place the lid on the jar straight away when it's hot. And there are the stewed apples. Obviously the jar is a little large for the apples. Normally you would make sure that it actually would fit in its size.
Melissa, what's all the natural sugars?
Natural sugars are honeys and maple syrup and something like coconut sugar. They are the three, and rice malt sugar is also another syrup. They are natural, the four most common natural sugars. Now I find honey can really change the taste of what you're cooking with. Maple syrup is a little less pungent, it's not as powerful, so you don't change the flavors as much. But I seem to be using a lot more coconut sugar these days. I used to use rice malt syrup a lot more. You know, it depends on what you are cooking with. But if you were to be poaching and you want to be sugar-free, I would use the coconut sugar. I would use the same quantities, 1 cup of coconut sugar. It just looks like brown sugar. It will come out a darker, richer flavour, which is absolutely delicious.
So if you're diabetic, you can use those natural sugars?
You know, I think in terms of diabetes, you just need to be reducing your sugar intake. You know, you need to check with your dietitian, with your doctor, because it's still sugar. It's still a simple carbohydrate. So it doesn't mean you can eat more coconut sugar because you're a diabetic. No, it's still the same value. It still is a simple sugar. It's just a better sugar for your body to be able to digest.
Thank you.
Where do you buy the coconut sugar?
Yeah, you can buy coconut sugar in Coles, in Woolworths, in Harris Farm. I mentioned Costco. You can buy a really big kilo bag, which is a really good price. And, you know, you can even go online and have a look where to buy coconut sugar. It's something that should be in all of our kitchens.
Is it extracted from the coconut itself?
Yes, That's exactly right. I'm actually not so sure on the process, but it is, the process is much simpler, and that's why it is better for you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Are the proportions always 2 for 1 for poaching? So the poaching will take around half an hour, I think, on my recipe that I've given you. It does take a while, and it depends on how thick your pears are, how unripe they are. If they're really green, they'll take longer. And I would, you start with at least half an hour. You make sure that the temperature is low with the pears. And if you keep the lid on, a lot of the steam will stay in the pot. If your lid is off, the steam will release and you'll need to add more water to the pot. Do you ever poach or stew in the oven? That's an interesting question, Miriam. I don't poach in the oven. I will bake my fruit in the oven. There's nothing nicer than baked apples. I do get pears, whole pears, keep the skin on, cut them in half, scoop out the seeds, and I will sprinkle them with maple syrup and, my almonds, and bake them in the oven. I find with poaching, you can poach. You definitely can poach in the oven. I like to keep my eye on them to see how they are going. When you're entertaining, it's really important to make sure that if your oven is on, to use that energy is important. But for me, I wouldn't just put my pears in the oven on their own and heat up the whole oven and use that whole oven space. I would rather use a little gas hot plate and use a smaller amount of energy there. But yes, if you've got something else into the oven, place the pears or the apples in the oven and poach them there. You've just got to make sure the oven is a lot hotter. It depends on what you put your apples or your pears in, because if it's ceramic, it will heat up and it will make the whole area around the pears much hotter, so they may not need as much cooking time. We've got a couple of more minutes. Any more questions on poaching or any food questions? I'm here to help. Look at this. Have you had coconut yogurt? It is delicious. Absolutely delicious. These pears are good. They're good. So delicious. I can taste the cinnamon. The star anise is coming through. The cardamom is wonderful. The pears haven't taken on too much, haven't taken on the sugar. It really is a true pear flavour, which is delicious. Okay. Do you have your poaching recipe in writing? Yes, we do, Vanessa. It is actually on the Dinero website, and Sorrel is going to post you the link again in the chat area there. The recipes are available. There we are. She's a good girl. Straight onto it. Thank you, Sorrel. So yes, any other questions, you can contact us at Dinero. You can reach out to me at info@miacucina.com.au. You can be following me on Instagram. I'm going to show you what that looks like. You need to look out for that M. Can you see the letter M there? That's Mia Cucina. That's my logo. And you can see my little story down there. There we go. There's our pear workshop. You can follow me on Instagram. You can follow on Facebook. Thank you everyone for joining. We've had wonderful numbers here this morning. Just to let you know, our next cooking series, we have Lisa Goldberg from the Monday Morning Cooking Club. Lisa's doing carrot cake with Angeline Lazarus. That would be beautiful. Love a good carrot cake icing. Okay, guys, thank you so much for joining. Really appreciate your support.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, Melissa. That was
So good.
fantastic. Thank you very
Wonderful.
much indeed.
Thanks, guys.
Thank
Bye.
See you next time.
Thank you,
Bye.
Melissa.
See you
Bye.
on Instagram. Bye.